This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everyone and welcome. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Rob Young, who has written a wonderful new book called The Magic Box, which is all about the wonders of television and film from the 60s and 70s and early 80s. It's a fantastic read, and there's a heck of a lot to discover. If you wish to follow me, you can do on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. Like and subscribe and spread the word as far and wide as you possibly can about the podcast. But before you do any of that, enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, I moved here in 2012, so yeah, it's kind of it's become a permanent move. I can't really see myself going back to live in Britain really in the foreseeable future. What about you? Are you living in Italy?
I'm living in Italy. Yeah, I've been here since '99. I was
Wow.
here. I
Okay.
was here for I was here for a bit of '98 as well, but '99 was when we sort of did what I imagine you did and sort of decided this is probably where we're going to settle. So yeah, so it's been a long time.
Yeah.
It's a length of time that makes you think you're not sure which football team you're going to support in the European final.
Yeah. You sort of zoom out, so you sort of maybe it becomes less about the local where you are or where you've come from, and
absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, if it's not a rude question, how old are you? Because from reading your book, I was thinking, God, you must be like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years older than me, but you don't look 5 or 6 years older than me.
Well, thanks. Well, I was born in '68, so
right.
That makes me 50. I'm at the age where you stop remembering exactly how old you are, but I think that's 53.
I keep doing that. Yeah. I keep doing this thing where I get to my birthday and people say, how old are you? And I realize I'm now the age that I've been saying I've been all year.
Yeah.
I've been saying I'm 49, and then I get to my birthday and I think, oh no, now I am 49. I just assumed I was, So I'm now 50, okay. But I'm actually 49. The next birthday I will be 50.
Yeah. You've got your sort of a jump ahead. Yeah.
Exactly. But look, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It was so in my wheelhouse reading this. So much that was familiar and well, I would say sort of half and half. Half of it was really familiar and I really got and I understood. Half of it was stuff that most of which I think I'd heard about and were really famous in a sort of, you come across those names like, I don't know, the Stone Tapes I've never seen, for instance, and that. But also like, what a wonderful sort of list you've given me of films to now go and find. Is a lot of this stuff still available?
Yeah, I mean, what I really didn't want was to end up with a book which is frustrating because you're reading about all this stuff and you just can't get hold of it, to see. So it's a combination of things that are, I think nearly everything mentioned in the book you can get to see. Quite a lot of it's been reissued officially, especially the BFI have done an amazing job in the last 10 to 15 years, putting out a lot of really interesting but formerly quite obscure material, both film and television stuff. But I mean, YouTube has obviously been the kind of savior for the researcher in many ways. There's an extraordinary amount of retrospective stuff posted up there, whether it's, I don't know, where half of it comes from, some of it clearly from people's private VHS tape collection, but you can get to see a lot of stuff on there. And of course, there are slightly less official channels as well you can go down. But I mean, I didn't do very much of that. I actually found that most of what I wanted to see was actually viewable in a pretty kind of open public way, which is incredible, really, which is in a way what makes doing a book like this possible now, in a sense. especially if you don't live, as I don't now, within kind of proximity of the BFI archive or an archive. You can go and see stuff screened. I did have a couple of private screenings at the BFI to look at some very difficult to track down stuff, which I was very grateful for. But it is an age now where it's kind of easier to write a kind of book like this because you just do have better access to a lot of previously forgotten material.
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of the archaeology you can do via the internet rather than in sort of a Morgan Freeman in Seven style library investigation.
Yeah.
What because you've written in the past on music primarily, is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, that's quite right. Yeah.
What led you towards film writing? What led you to? Well, I mean, actually, I should say for the listeners that it's the Magic Box is really, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's really like a look at the TV, the films, to some degree the music and the books of that period. You mentioned quite a few authors as well who pop up. So what led you in that direction? What
I suppose it came gradually. I mean, I started out my sort of career as a writer, writing on music. I worked for the Wire magazine for many years. I was always very interested in kind of music that wasn't mainstream, experimental music, but really sort of across the board in terms of style and genre. And I mean, I guess at the same time, really, as I discovered music as a teenager, I was also discovering film, art film, as I write about in the book. I was just sort of growing up at a time which was particularly rich for interesting content on the television and in the cinemas. And so I kind of, in a way, I mean, it's just the idea of being interested in culture and the arts generally, to me, is just really, it's just sort of common sense in a way. I don't really make divisions. And, I guess as a writer, I'm sort of always interested in looking at connections and threads between things. And that can be just purely on a musical level. If you're, the book I did 10 years ago, which in a way was the sort of seed for the Magic Box, was a book called Electric Eden, which was a kind of an attempt to understand what folk, the idea of folk has meant for the British. And, kind of, it started out what I wanted to write a history of mainly kind of folk rock from the 60s and 70s, which just happened to be a music that I love very much. But it turned out to be, you start going down that road and you sort of say, well, actually, when did people start talking about folk? Where does the idea of folk come from? It actually came from the mid-19th century, part of a kind of folk revival. It's bound up with a sense of wanting to preserve things that are being lost in the industrial revolution. And you kind of, and then that gives you a sort of seed of an idea that you then see percolating through a history of music, right up to the present day. And it just seemed natural to me, writing that book, to drop in references to some literature, romantic literature, for example, and certain films that seem to evoke a sense of the past, that seems to be very interested in looking for ways to evoke the past. And a kind of, I was also, it comes down to things like looking at the sort of feel of album covers from the sort of folk rock era of the late 60s and thinking, well, a lot of the films of that time had the same kind of color palette and the same kind of grain and the same way of showing landscape in a very sort of British sense of the landscape. And I suppose it sort of just slid sideways from that into thinking about wanting to kind of evoke the texture of film and television from a certain period. And then, maybe that was the seed of it in a sense, but I think I refer in that earlier book to programs like Pender's Fen, that played for today from 1974. So I think I mentioned Tony Richardson's Charge of the Light Brigade, because I was really fascinated in to find out that for that, the cinematographer, David Watkins, sought out these kind of Victorian lenses to sort of put on the front of his cameras. He literally wanted to see that, film that historical recreation sort of literally through Victorian glass. That it seemed to me a really sort of fascinating idea of this kind of antiquarian eye. That seems to be very much a part of sort of British kind of cultural thinking in a sense. So it's these sort of details, I think, that sort of made me want to look further at the kind of this sort of continuum of film and television in Britain, and how it's been concerned with representing the past, how it's to do with the kind of different sort of cultural memories. And It's sort of evolved, I mean, the book, ended up in a different shape from the one I planned, as books often seem to do. Bits expand here and there that you don't expect, and then certain bits contract, and it kind of finds its own form in a sense. But
what was the most surprising direction you took, or that the book took?
I suppose originally, I probably, the bulk of it was more thinking. I guess the sort of central part was what a lot of people would refer to as folk horror, and everything that kind of spins out of that, and to a certain extent, kind of British strange science fiction from the 50s and 60s, and I guess. What happened was I also wanted to touch on the kind of historical representation and costume drama and so on, but that kind of became a bigger part of the book, and it's divided up into big sections, this book. But I became interested in looking at, you could say, the slightly more kind of muddy, gritty side of period drama, things that show rebellions, underground movements and alternative histories, and things that kind of show the kind of big splits in society, in a sense, the sort of the divides and inequalities that exist. And at the same time, that moved into also, there's a chapter on kind of geographical programs and films, you could say, things that have actually tried consciously to explore the sort of geography of Britain, but as you're doing that, you also get a kind of psychogeography, or the obvious example is the programs and films of Sir John Betjeman, who kind of did these travelogues mainly on the railways in the 1960s, and there are these incredible sort of, he's kind of nostalgic for a Britain that's disappearing, but he's also, he's also kind of musing on, he's showing you historical details and telling you what things were like, before bombs hit them, and it's a sort of very, very evocative, slightly sort of melancholic tone to those programs. And sort of spinning out from there are other kind of televisual guides to the landscape that I found really interesting. So, and that kind of went forward into more recent filmmakers like Patrick Keeler and Chris Pettit and so on, who also explore the sort of hidden patterns in landscape and the effect of capitalism on the way the country looks. So, again, it was sort of like you just sort of follow the threads, and see where they take you. That's the amazing thing about doing a book like this is, you sort of get taken on trips and down strange lanes, and you kind of just follow. And and also, of course, as you go, people are always recommending you stuff as well that you've never heard of. So you sort of like, it's like you're walking down a lane and you get all these sort of brambles and sticky buds attaching to you.
I love the way you're mentioning all this sort of like very English, British sort of countryside stuff. Because when I was reading your book, I was thinking, oh, this is just so evocative of like Bracken. Something like Bracken I kept thinking of, and Cow's Parsley, and what John le Carré called skies dark with waiting rain.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think you would have written this book if you hadn't been living away from England?
No, I definitely would have done it. I mean, I actually started it before I moved away. So, no, it was definitely something that I wanted to do. Possible that it's, in some ways, the job is easier when you're not in the middle of it. You kind of get
just thinking of James Joyce writing about Dublin while he sits in Trieste.
Well, very flattering comparison, John, but
I'm talking about Dublin as James Joyce and Portrait of Artist. I'm not talking about Finnegan's Wake, James. Just as sales plummet.
No, I mean, it definitely helps give a perspective and a more sort of bird's eye view of things in a way. And but I'm not sure it would have been a vastly different book if I'd still been living in Britain. But it's possible that not, I mean, especially in the last couple of years, I haven't been back. So I do really miss the countryside and the whole sort of, a lot of the things about the landscape of Britain I haven't seen with my own eyes for a long time. And definitely like watching a lot of this stuff does help you, reconnect with the atmosphere of your homeland.
Where did you grow up? Because this is such a regionally specific book as well. It made me wonder, where were you walking when you were a kid?
No, I grew up in Bristol.
Right. Okay.
And that's sort of maybe significant because it is, it's quite a green city and still is. And I grew up was very lucky to grow up right next to a big kind of open parkland space called Durham Downs. And so, there was a lot of tree climbing and running around, as a kid, being outside a lot, as well as watching tons of TV. So, it was sort of combined everything. So, yeah, there was definitely parts of my childhood life that, were like a sort of public information film, sort of running around doing dangerous things with sticks in the forest. But yeah, Bristol's interesting because, it's one of those cities, a lot of layers of history quite visible on the streets, and you're not too far from pretty deep English countryside there either, and there was a lot of drives out to Somerset and holidays in Devon and Cornwall, and so it's the southwest of England is very deep in my veins for sure. So yeah, it's definitely a factor. I don't know, if I'd grown up in the middle of London, I might not have quite had the sort of sensibility maybe about it, but it's really hard to say. But definitely a lot of greenery is sort of somehow ingrained in my memories of childhood in a sense. Yeah.
Are you not far from Wales?
No, that's right. Yeah, yeah. We used to go quite a lot over to Wales, and you could actually pick up Welsh TV channels from where we lived as well. So you could sort of watch the Welsh version of Channel 4, which is this weird sort of parallel universe. But
I remember Paul Whitehouse was talking about that in terms of his, he used to do that old man who would be sitting sort of bumbling, and you could only understand every 12th word. And he said he got the idea from listening to Welsh radio, so that he would hear somebody speaking a foreign language and then saying Tony Blair. Tony Blair, and that would be the So one of again, I really love this because it's felt like you were reading my head. There's all the nostalgic bits that you're inside, you're watching the television, you describe the television very physically. So you also, and going to the cinema, you describe specific moments when you're going to see films, and even a specific moment when you're like an extra in Hearts of Fire, the Bob Dylan, Rupert Everett star. I saw Rupert Everett last week, actually, in the flesh, in a new film that was showing at Locarno, and I'm trying to remember the name of the film now. She Will, it's called, by a director called Claude. Okay, I'm going to edit in me saying the name correctly. And it's folk horror. It's and I wanted to ask you about this actually. Sorry, just like your book, that question has organically evolved. Out of my control, beyond the limits of my own memory. What I wanted to ask you is, like, this seems like a moment, a really good timing, because there is a real revival of folk horror. There's been a documentary recently, and there are films like Censor. Ben Wheatley's just brought out a new film. This film that I saw in Locarno, which I'm sure will be out in autumn, She Will. Is there a danger of sort of with this revival of something that, as you said, was in itself kind of revival, or was about revival? Is there a danger that we're sort of getting diminishing returns, or there's a spiral in, or how do you feel about it, about this more recent?
I don't see it as diminishing returns at all. I'm actually really excited by the fact that, in a way, over the period of writing this book, when I started, which was about 2011, it really felt like, okay, this is going to be a pretty archival, Retromania type exploration of, stuff from dusty boxes in the attic kind of thing, in terms of film history, and which was fine for me, but it definitely kind of like somehow felt located in a certain time and a period that was now gone. But over the period of writing it, what's been amazing is that there have been, as you say, this kind of resurgence of certain filmmakers and certain productions for TV that seem to pick right up, from all those threads that were left.
You mentioned Mark Gatiss as well as Mark Gatiss and Inside Number 9 and.
Absolutely. Those guys, are clearly all over this stuff anyway. And Mark made that documentary called Home Counties Horror, which sort of like took the three what are often referred to as the unholy trinity of folk horror films as a starting point, which find a general Blood on Satan's Claw and the Wicker Man, which is a reasonable starting point for talking about that. And at the same time, Ben Wheatley came out with Kill List, and a couple of years later, Field in in England, which, and now his new film, which I actually haven't seen yet, In the Earth, that just sounds like, a kind of bingo card in a sense of folk, ideas about folk horror and things being buried underground coming up to haunt us. But at the same time,
I guess that's what I meant by the cliche a little bit. I definitely, I love Kill List. Field in England, I think is great. And In the Earth, I just felt like exactly what you said there. It's like, this the bingo card of, it's stuff that I like, so I enjoyed it, but
I haven't seen the film, so I don't really feel equipped to comment any further than that. I don't want to sound glib about it.
Sure, fair enough.
But at the same time, I felt, I in the book, I included a bit on the BBC series Detectorists, for example, which to me seemed to do a wonderful job in a sort of gently comic format of exploring very similar ideas about our relationship to history, local history, community, trying to dig up things that are buried underground that have some resonance, while at the same time being a fantastic kind of character sort of kind of comedy as well. That to me sits right in there. And also you have a film like Bait by Mark Jenkin, set in Cornwall, looking at a contemporary tensions between country and city, what money is doing to the economy of very tiny localities, set in the present, shot on an ancient Bolex camera, lots of sort of artificially enhanced grain, black and white, it looks like a John Grierson documentary from the 30s, so it's sort of like the film encapsulates this sort of tension between the present and the past, and it's sort of, so that again fitted right in, and luckily that came out in time for me to include it in the book. That, he's got a new film in the works, I believe, as well, which I'm looking forward to seeing. So also a filmmaker, George Popov, who's filmed The Droving, I enjoyed very much. And, so it feels like there are people out there with, a similar kind of sensibility to the sort of themes that I was exploring in the Magic Box, and I don't feel it's always just ticking off the relevant points. I think people are finding new and interesting ways to interpret those ideas.
Yeah. Maybe it's just our generation. Maybe it's just a generation who've been brought up on this kind of television and movies are now making their own movies, writing their own scripts. And so, do you think nostalgia of this kind is a sort of something quite specific to Britain? I wonder if other countries have this similar sort of idea of, I don't know, I think maybe what you talk about in the book as well about the Industrial Revolution sort of creating a division in how you live, so you're taken away from the land, so there's always this sense that we really should get back to the land somehow, but that might be dangerous as well. I don't know, even in Norway, do you feel there's this same kind of nostalgia, same kind of... No,
that's what's interesting. It's really hard to generalize about any nation, and it's particularly hard to generalize about Britain, I think, because it's so many different things going on in that society, and it's an extremely diverse population. But the sort of feeling, Norway has a very different history. It doesn't have any colonial history. It was sort of a vassal state of either Denmark or Sweden at various times until effectively about 100 years ago. And so it had the chance to kind of design quite a modern constitution for itself in the beginning of the 20th century. And so the other thing is that its relationship to the landscape is totally different. There was no aristocracy, so you don't have the same sort of physical setup of, the manor house, the private land, the village, the church, the pub. It's not really set up like that. And also, you have a massive sort of legal right to pretty much walk anywhere. There's very little private land in the sense that we know it in Britain. In Britain, I kind of very often feel, if I'm walking around or driving around, that you have the sense that most of what you're seeing, you're not really allowed to go into it. There's walls, there's gates, there's keep out signs, there's, a lot of it is owned privately. In Norway, the landscape doesn't have that. It's open. It's not, lots of it is mountain and, kind of open wilderness, which is all effectively for the people. So what that means is that at the same time, it doesn't come freighted with all the history that British landscape does. You're not walking around and you see a plaque saying, there was a battle fought here in 1649, or there's not suddenly a museum here. I mean, I feel like, there's a lot of legibility, like you're encouraged to read the British landscape a lot as you're going through it. There's a lot that's gone on those fields and on those paths and around those houses. In Norway, it's more like there's a sense of you could say like a sense of the sublime still around landscape, because it sort of still feels very untouched. A lot of it unfarmed, it's wild. At the same time, because there's not much sort of like big tracts of privately owned land, you don't have that sort of sense of mystery that comes, I think that's why perhaps we have so many sort of, eerie, that strange sort of atmospheric films about the landscape is because, a lot of the landscape is a mystery because you can't access it. So that sets you off, like what could be going on behind those walls, it's just, so psychologically, it's a very different relationship to the landscape. And I'm sure it's probably something different in Italy as well. I don't know, but I think, it's definitely, I mean, in terms of the nostalgia of Britain, I mean, again, not without wanting to generalize, but I think that what the British tend to do well as a kind of culture is preservation. I mean, there's flaws in the way our heritage is presented, but that's kind of starting to be addressed in certain circles, which is really interesting. But, we, in terms of sort of presentation, we do pageantry, we do heritage, we do, museums, archives. What we're not perhaps so good at is imagining where we want to go and imagining concretely what the future of the country should be, how that should look, and I think that's, that's for all sorts of reasons, short-termism in government, just, also perhaps a sense that, I think a lot of it is to do with legacies of the war, kind of having sort of won, in inverted commas, the war. There was less pressure to evolve and move forward and rebuild and rethink, for the sort of coming years. And so, I think there's loads of factors feeding into this. But, I think what that adds up to is that, and I think we have seen that clearly in the last few years, is we are sort of quite a nostalgic nation. What's interesting is the way over time that nostalgia has been reclaimed, on all sides of the political spectrum. And as you sort of implied earlier, that can have dangerous consequences. I think it can lead you down certain paths, and I think it can really, nostalgia can really, cause a kind of stagnation in a culture as well. But the sort of paradox of being British and perhaps especially English, is that it's so much part of the way you're kind of conditioned to think, that it is quite hard to imagine fully what it would be to be entirely free of that nostalgia. And that kind of difficulty that I think, I'm not sure the British or the English or whatever are ever going to be fully free of that, to be honest. I feel like it's so deeply ingrained, and it's clearly at this point we've reached a point where it has really, these kind of issues are really splitting the country. And that's something else that I tried to touch on at some point in the book. There's a section in there called The Divided Kingdom, which is actually named in homage to a novel by Rupert Thompson that I like very much, where he kind of imagines the nation sort of divided into 4 humours and sort of the population divided. It's a really interesting kind of post-Orwellian novel, which I recommend. But there's a lot of things out there that sort of express where these different kind of divisions are coming from, and films that have tried to show poverty and dilapidation and inequity. So
I mean, let's go, because I could definitely talk to you all day about this, in the sense that I think living abroad as an expat, you become the resident expert on your country as well. That people are always asking you, what does Britain think about this, that, or the other? And it's like, so it's and I totally understand the danger of generalization, but heck, it's fun as well, let's face it. To be the expert. Let's talk a little bit about your sort of watching film career, in terms of like when you were a kid. You mentioned loads of these great children's programs, which I often show my own kids when they were growing up. I'll say, we've got to find Bagpuss on YouTube and show them an episode, and it's just so weird. And it wasn't just Bagpuss, it was Jamie and His Magic Torch and Dramarama, the spooky kids series. And there seemed to be a lot of sort of quite, well, you just bring up a lot of it. You bring a lot of it back, stuff that I haven't even thought about for years. A lot of sort of quite dark stuff. And then you have the same thing happening in novels with things like Susan Cooper and Alan Garner, who you also mentioned. Even to some degree, Tolkien and Richard Adams. It's this sort of it's not necessarily folk horror, but it's coming from the same loam.
Absolutely. I mean, the one that I always remembered, sort of after seeing it, and I remember kind of like, for example, as a student, sort of saying to people, "Do you remember this series called The Changes?" Sort of kids program, and nobody remembered it. It was really weird. It was like I was the only one who'd ever seen it.
Was it on ITV?
It was on the BBC in 1975, and
right.
It's this. I just never forgot it. And then kind of in the last sort of 10 years or so, it's been reissued now on a DVD by the BFI, and it's kind of come that people are sort of now remembering it again. Also, it had a wonderful BBC Radiophonic Workshop electronic soundtrack, but that was something that just absolutely scared the pants off me, just because it was sort of the first minutes are just this kind of very sort of like enervated household with parents and a daughter, and then just suddenly there's this noise in the air, and the parents just suddenly start smashing up every technological object in the house. Like the dad grabs a golf club and starts smashing the TV. They go outside and people are overturning buses and cars, and it's just like there's this sudden total kind of anarchy, and it's all directed against technology, and then the whole country rejects it and goes back to a sort of pre-industrial way of life. And the story is about the girl who goes wandering around the countryside and seeing what's going on. It's become a very superstitious society again. It's sort of like there are kind of witch hunts going on, and it's absolutely terrifying stuff, and it's it's still pretty powerful today. And that for me kind of again sort of sums up a lot of what we got exposed to as kids on TV. There was a lot of apocalyptic stuff like that. There was a lot of witchcraft, and Children of the Stones is another one people often talk about. That was an ITV series that again kind of combined, it was filmed around the Avebury Stone Circle. It kind of combined a sort of pagan evil cult with sort of a young kind of whiz kid who was sort of exploring the acoustic science of the stones with these sort of kind of oscilloscopes and things. And so you had these things that suggested sort of dark cult forces and things. There's a kind of secret channels and under the surface of society, which it was great to watch at the time. And I look back and it's so different to what kids are shown now on TV. It's just fascinating, And one thing that one direction this book could have gone in was to try and I did sort of have an idea that I would try and track down people who are behind the commissioning of these kinds of things, and sort of, they're not all around anymore. That's the trouble. And it just logistically, that just proved a step too far in terms of getting this book produced. So, I ended up it's not really an interview-based book. It is really a sort of personal journey through a lot of these films. But, it would have been interesting, to sort of, but the machinations of the film and television industries, obviously, it's not always so easy to draw clear lines behind, why things get done. There are all sorts of incidental reasons why things turn out as they are. But it does point to an era where interesting material was allowed to get through and get made. Another one is the Owl Service, which I was too young to see at the time. That was made in very end of the 60s, early 70s. It's really sophisticated television. It doesn't feel like a children's series at all when you see it now. The dialogue is pretty opaque. The camera work is really interesting, very sophisticated kind of production design. And then at the same time you have, on the other side you have the things you mentioned, the small films type animations, these very sort of folky, craftsy things like Bagpuss and Finger Bobs and so on, which have this wonderful sort of folk music. They have a lovely grain in the footage. Even I remember, even at the time they looked like that. It's not the sort of patina of age. They were shot in a way that suggests a kind of age already, which is very, very sort of appealing. And Bagpuss is absolutely about the folk collecting process itself. It is, every episode is about an object that's found, and they have to sort of ascertain the origin of it through singing about it, telling stories around it, and in the process they turn it into something new again. And that's exactly what folk does, with a song or whatever, or with a.
And Professor Yaffle is the sort of expert that Michael Gove says we've had enough of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you do have enough of him in Bagpuss as well. So I'm sorry. But yeah, he's the kind of academic, who wants to overthink things, but actually manages to miss the point, on almost every occasion. Which is quite funny, quite amusing.
That's one of the things that really struck me about reading your book was as soon as I read it, I went, oh yeah, I see that now. It's not like I grew up thinking, oh yeah, this is all of these things are connected in this way. But once you reading it in black and white in front of me, I just started thinking of loads of examples of wacky, blimey, there was a hell of a lot of science fiction and fantasy in children's TV.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for that. Also a lot of children's books at the time as well. I loved things like the Tripods trilogy, John Christopher, and I remember reading John Wyndham books and short stories and things, at a fairly early age. And these were very much there. But I mean, of course, the other thing is that there was a lot more. The television was also a kind of a really good repertory cinema. In the 70s and 80s. I mean, in a way that it isn't, terrestrial TV now doesn't really show movies to the same curated extent. But I mean, it was, you could really, there were tons of, like sci-fi movies from the 50s and 60s being shown. There were sort of, French art movies, like loads of horror Hammer movies on Friday nights. I mean, that's why I don't feel, I know some people are probably not happy about the idea of a book that sort of just treats film and television as a continuum. That is kind of heretical, I know, to some. Two idiots,
Rob. Well, it's heretical to idiots.
They're not often discussed, perhaps in the sort of kind of like fluid way that I chose to do. But the fact is that I saw a lot of the movies I saw on television for the first time, and I don't really. It's not that important to me whether something is a TV program or a film.
My formal film education was Movie Drone by Alex Cox and BBC Two
Channel 4.
Channel 4, exactly. BBC Two Sunday afternoon double bills, where they put a Spencer Tracy double bill or a film noir or whatever.
Exactly, and there was also a lot of discourse about film on TV. I mean, maybe not a lot, but I remember these fantastic film essays by Lindsay Anderson did one, I think, in the 80s for Channel 4. There were these kind of I think Alan Clarke did one as well, just sort of essay documentaries by great filmmakers, and it was just, I mean, there was more discussion of the arts on TV as well than there is now, in a more kind of, in a less sort of apologetic way. And for me, that was very inspiring and very illuminating.
I remember there was a children's program I brought it up in a previous podcast called something. I think it was called Clapperboard, and it was sort of like it would go onto the set of For Your Eyes Only or something, and it was purely for kids. It wasn't. It was like a kids' version of the Barry Norman show, really.
And you had screen test as well. A kids' quiz about film as well. So there were lots of ways to sort of to be exposed to the world of film then, and which is great. Yeah.
Let's fluidly slip over to cinema for a little while, because you mentioned earlier on the trilogy of English or British folklore, because of course Wicker Man is filmed in Scotland. The biggest compliment I think I could make this book, well, actually it's not, but it is a good compliment for any film book, is that after reading it all day yesterday, last night I sat down and I did a double bill of The Wicker Man and The Draftsman's Contract, because I wanted to watch two sort of, both of which I'd already seen, but both of which I'd probably last seen the early 90s, a long time ago. First of all, your description of The Wicker Man as a musical, which I scoffed at when I read it. I was like, that's nonsense. And then I watched it and went, bloody hell, they never stop singing in this film. They sing all the way through it. It is a musical. It's, chapeau.
Well, good. I'm glad I convinced you. I was hoping, I mean, it was a little tongue-in-cheek writing that. I don't know, maybe it didn't entirely come across. But I mean, it is true. There are a lot of songs in it, and a lot of the key moments in the film, in the story, are enacted through song or music.
Yeah.
So
No,
how do you
absolutely.
define a musical?
No, absolutely. I mean, Britt Ekland, when she...
the West End adaptation, yeah.
Right. Britt Ekland actually sort of sings to camera. It's not like even that there's just a song happening. She sings, she addresses the camera as in sort of
It's like a pop video, yeah.
And she manages to be 3 different people during that sequence as well, which I'm sure anybody who's seen the film will remember. I won't need to describe it. Because Annie Ross, I think, is doing her voice, and Britt Ekland is there, and every time she turns her back to the camera, you get a full-length shot. It's a body double.
They had a body double, yeah, exactly.
With very obviously different length hair as well.
Yeah.
Hair sort of shortens.
You obviously had your finger on the freeze frame, yeah.
No, I'm just extremely well-trained as a film critic to pick up on this stuff. I probably freeze-framed it so much when it was a VHS that still burned into my memory. But that, I mean, God almighty, that film is magnificent. It's a genuinely disturbing film, but it's also genuinely funny, and it sort of genuinely has something to say as well.
It does stand up. I mean, the first time I watched it not really knowing, hadn't really read around it. It's quite a long time ago now. I just had heard people talking about it, and I just watched it not knowing where it was going to go at all, which is a great way to watch that film. No, I mean, and I've watched it many times since now, and it's just visually, it's an extraordinary film. Unsettling sort of atmosphere and climate. Obviously, it was famously, set in midsummer but filmed in the autumn. So, it just has shadows are longer than they should be. The late, the golden time just doesn't look like summer golden time somehow. It's sort of, and, it's this kind of, for me, although it's made and set in Scotland, it seems to me it is kind of like a sort of pageant of pan-British folk costumes and traditions and superstitions, and it sort of just piles them all, many of them, into this film. So, which I think is one of those things that just, makes it still sort of broadly appealing, and somehow, takes it away from. And you kind of forget that you're in Scotland, I think, to a certain extent. It is sort of a world out of time, and that's the world that the islanders want to create, obviously, as well. They are creating a pagan society on a private island. Obviously, you don't want. They want to shut the rest of the world out. They want to make a new world on this island. So, all these ideas, I think, are that idea of a social experiment like that, kind of starting again, is sort of one that's appealed to a lot of writers and people. Yeah.
What I think as well seems specifically English about about this sort of experiment, or the nature of it, is that it doesn't have like the other sort of the sort of first stop for most people when you're thinking about cults is something like the Manson Family, and it's cult based on youth and based on experimentation and based on breaking a load of social boundaries and all the rest of it. But with these English versions and British versions, also because you've got a very colonial aspect of it, of the Lord coming in and actually just imposing this as a new way of doing things. It reminded me of another point in the book where you talk about every suburban home having a Dennis Wheatley novel, and the guy who wrote Witchcraft being a member of the local Conservative Party and sort of drinking tea and reading the Telegraph and what have you. That this is not necessarily a radical sort of, not that Manson was by any means left wing or progressive. I mean, he was a complete racist and neo-Nazi, but you have this sort of conservative idea of a cult. Is that how it feels to you as well? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of our conservative, if you're talking small c conservatism,
exactly,
there's often a real grey area between what is conservative and what is radical. That's the thing. It's like, a lot of the levelers after the Civil War, sort of, they were the rebels against the old order, but they actually wanted to go back to a kind of, the most extreme wanted to go back to a sort of Garden of Eden and sort of start right again, which you could say is the ultimate form of conservatism. So, it's not a sort of clear, to me, it's not always clear cut. What I think the Wicker Man does so brilliantly with it is that they start off in the cockpit of Sergeant Howie, the policeman who you kind of assume is going to be, he's the hero, the lawman coming to sort everything out, but it's just the way the film breaks him down, and actually kind of makes you dislike this person really, because of his kind of sort of kind of religiousness, and
he's kind of like a prig, isn't he? It's a bit
and piousness, and the way, I mean, I'm not sure you get to like the pagan community, but it shows there's a logical reason for them behind everything they do and everything they believe and all the rituals they perform, which are clearly laid out during the film. And that's what's so effective about it. And there's this other fantastic detail in the movie where literally the first frame, you remember what the first frame of the movie is? Like literally the first thing you see. It's easy to forget because of It's an intertitle that says something like, the makers of this film would like to thank the inhabitants of Summerisle for their cooperation.
Yes,
Summerisle is a fictional island, so it's like it's kind of like right from the beginning, the film is saying kind of we've been we're on the sort of community side. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. I don't know if it was there in the original script or if it came in afterwards, but it completely. So I didn't really notice it the first time I saw it, but the sort of subsequent viewings, I kind of just picked up on that, and I thought
they're like sort of anthropologists going into this thing. And thanks very much for welcoming us, and we respect your point of view. We don't necessarily agree with it, but we're not going to impose our view on you.
Sort of legitimacy in a way to what's going on that island, in a really sort of like it's just sort of thrown in there, but it's fascinating, So it really leaves you. I think the strength of the film is that there's no clear good guys and bad guys. There's certain things about how he, obviously nobody should go around burning people in a giant, effigy. But there's things about Howie that are unappealing and authoritarian and dictatorial. And there are things about the pagan way of life that are really appealing. They're in touch with nature, they're in touch with the natural crop cycles, and
they're incredibly musical.
They're very beautifully musical in a folk rock kind of way. They're comfortable with their sexuality. They like a drink, so,
they like having a good time. The landlord's daughter.
It doesn't look too bad, apart from the ritualistic sacrifice.
Apart from the occasional murder.
I'd be tempted to sign up, if it wasn't for that.
Yeah, I mean, well, the film really sort of ends on so obviously if you don't want to spoil Wicker Man, then go away and watch it immediately. But the ending is just sets up a dialectic that it doesn't resolve. He's shouting his Christian prayers and they're singing their pagan songs, and it's kind of, okay, take your choice. It's up to you. Who do you want to be with? It kind of leaves on a literally dissonant ending, which is so amazing. It's those two musics just clashing against each other, two musics, two ways of seeing the world, that just never mesh in any way. They never harmonize. And, that's part of this sort of divided kingdom idea for me, is that, there are perhaps fault lines that are never quite possible to patch up or fill in, and I think that's why that film is still, very, very appealing, or still really resonates. There's still lots to pick out of that film. Yeah. And adults wearing animal masks is just,
it's always,
freaky
it's become
beyond
a thing,
belief.
yeah. And you see that cropping up in, Kill List has that. It's become a sort of folk horror, one of those bingo card things, perhaps, for folk horror. But there is still something creepy and eerie about the sight of that on film. It's it works, yeah. And because there's no explanation for it, especially in The Wicker Man, you just suddenly see these people on the quayside in masks. You've never seen that before. You don't know who they are or why they're doing it. It's just brilliantly done. It's just cuts to that suddenly, and it just throws the film into another gear.
There's also the aspect that this is not, you could argue that it's supernatural if the pagans are right. And if the pagans aren't right, then in the words of, Jesse Plemons in The Master, he's just making this shit as he goes along. He's making it up. It's not, it's all invented.
Yeah, well, there isn't anything supernatural in The Wicker Man. That's also what's so great. As in Witchfinder General, one of those other key folk horror films, there's no magic happening. It is, and there's actually, I think there's a line of dialogue in The Wicker Man where there's a bit of backstory from Christopher Lee about, and I think he says, that his father had set up a community there and so on, and he's just sort of perpetuating it. But there is a sense that, if the crops fail again, the next one to go might be the Lord himself, which is the sort of natural consequence. So there is a sense that he needs a sacrifice in some way, and but none of that has anything to do with witchcraft, or there's no unexplainable acts happening in that film.
The chances are that the crop will work next year because it'll just be returned to the mean. You had a bad harvest, and
exactly,
now you'll have a good one.
Yeah.
And it'll be read in like that. So moving from the Wicker Man, and I watched the Draftsman's Contract, which I think Peter Greenaway is one of those filmmakers that if he had died in 1993 would be considered one of our best filmmakers of that decade. But not unfortunately for him, obviously, but the fact that he sort of hung around and sort of did lots of obscure projects, and every single interview he's done since 1993, he's talked about the death of cinema, which is not endearing, doesn't endear him to me at least. But The Draftsman's Contract is such an amazing movie, I was again inspired by your book. I was seeing loads of connections. Fruit, for instance, comes up in both. Summer Isle, they're growing apples in a place where they shouldn't grow apples. And in Draftsman's Contract, that he's constantly eating from the garden. He's constantly eating these exotic, non-English fruits. The final scene, he is given a pineapple. In fact, the very final shot, if we're going to get down to details, is the statue you've seen wandering around through the entire film, trying the pineapple and spitting it at the camera. So it's a real sort of breaking of the frame of like, he's an old spirit of England or something, or a
sort of
Caliban.
a green man, isn't he? Sort of in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I love his role as well, that you think it's sort of a metafictional thing that the cinema is just doing, but then and the Mr. Neville, the draftsman, actually says, and who's that prat pretending to be pretending to be a statue? Just like
there's a lot of humor in Peter Greenaway, isn't there? There's a lot of kind of funny, quite throwaway lines across a lot of his films. I really loved. I remember seeing Drowning by Numbers when it came out. That was one of my first when I discovered the art cinema in Bristol. That was one of the first ones that I saw there. I thought that was brilliant, and that actually also opens. One of the early shots is sort of a wonderful autumnal pile of apples, I think, which is just almost like a kind of Cézanne painting or something. That sort of still life. There's a almost still sort of Dutch still life kind of aspect to it. But the Draftsman's Contract's great, isn't it? I hadn't seen it for a very long time until I watched it sort of for the book again, and it's sort of struck by the kind of the vividness of the design and the sort of. I was really intrigued by there's a recurring image of the draftsman's frame, isn't there? The sort of, which just, to me, that just became a television screen, as well. Or a lens, that he's looking through. I'm sure it's somehow a reference to also the act of filmmaking as well as making images.
Oh, absolutely, because he becomes a director, doesn't he? I don't want anyone in front of the house. From no coal is to be burned in the fireplaces, so there's no smoke, and
move the ladder out the way.
And then he uses his position of power to get to exploit and abuse sexually an otherwise powerful woman. It's just like, it's Harvey Weinstein.
But it's also, I included that film in my chapter about the country house, because it seemed to me a sort of interesting take on the sort of country house movie, which very often, and again, this is not a pattern I'd necessarily noticed until I put a lot of them together, but it's very often about an outsider to the world of the aristocratic country house coming into that milieu in some way and either disrupting it or kind of maybe joining it for a while and then sort of being spat out, destroyed by it or forever altered by it, not necessarily in a good way. And this is another example in a very Peter Greenaway sense of, it's the same. There is that pattern there. The artist, the journeyman artist, arriving in this pretty obnoxious household and trying to sort of take control over it, like you say, but ultimately being destroyed by it. And it's a really interesting rethink of that kind of pattern.
I do think that even that period, and I think you make the point similarly, the period of the early 80s and that sort of Thatcherite sort of heritage Britain. And I remember Alan Parker talking about the Merchant Ivory films as being the Laura Ashley of cinema. I always think those Merchant Ivory films were far more subversive and interesting than they frequently got credit for. And Remains of the Day is obviously very explicit in that, but I think Room with a View, and they're remembered as these sort of prestige, beautiful pieces of work, which they are, but they were never celebratory. They were never
No, I think maybe because of timing, I think they've sort of maybe seen under the same light as a film like Chariots of Fire or something, perhaps, which is perhaps more kind of patriotic, sort of unapologetic way. But no, you're right. I mean, I think it's interesting. They often came back to E.M. Forster, who was someone also who kind of saw, he was very interested in sort of like movement between class barriers and so on, and often, like, Howard's End, for example, is about somebody who wants sort of to better himself and it ends up destroyed by that as well. And so yes, I mean, I think because of their kind of surface lushness, I think perhaps it's easier to dismiss them. But yeah, I don't know. I think the sort of subject matter they were choosing was more interesting than that, and it kind of more poignant because they're filmed in that way, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, like a film like Maurice coming out, I think there is a little. I don't think I'm alone in this. I think there's quite a few people reassessing now and saying actually there's a lot more to these films than maybe they've been credited for. So yeah, and then we get Downton Abbey. I mean, it's interesting as well. You said something earlier on about our relationship to the landscape being one that is affected by the privatization of land and the refusal of access, so that it becomes mysterious. Also, this idea that you were talking about in terms of Downton Abbey projecting this sort of real image of that's what England is these country houses, and that's the sort of heritage industry has created. But of course, like for 90%, 99% of the people who live in England, their experience of a country house is that of a tourist. They're not, nobody's working there anymore, nobody's living there anymore. So it again becomes just this imaginary space.
Totally. And I mean, Downton Abbey for me is not a series I particularly enjoy, and it just feels aimed more at an American viewership anyway, to a certain extent. There were lots of things in the script and so on that sort of lots of Americanisms in the script, and it's just a picture of a kind of country house setup that doesn't ring true for me at all. It's just like the most liberal aristocratic household ever. Wonderful lasting friendships between the servants and the masters. And sort of the IRA supporting chauffeur. Yeah, marry my daughter, fine.
Why not?
Never going to happen in the 1920s. I mean, it's just sort of there was a certain level of I don't know. I felt like it was a really missed opportunity in a way to sort of. It just doesn't feel. I mean, I find Brideshead Revisited, the Granada series there, for example, where the staff in the house they're pretty much anonymous. I think they almost never have any lines. And all this kind of deep, difficult family business is conducted with them sort of standing around silently. I find that really powerful. I mean, of course, you could say, well, it would be fascinating to actually go behind the scenes there and find out what the staff was saying. But actually, it kind of leaves it to your imagination, which is really powerful. You think, my God, these are like the employees are standing around while this family is just being absolutely ghastly in lots of ways and tearing each other apart. And it's I mean, you can't help but sort of put yourself in the position of one of the staff in a way. You are, in a sense, being a viewer, and that to me says more about the anonymity. It says more to me in a way about that kind of divide than Downton Abbey. I actually feel it was sort of it didn't work, the attempt to show the upstairs and downstairs worlds, because they were way too chummy.
Yeah, there wasn't enough conflict. It wasn't enough.
Anything dramatic that happens to the housekeeper, she's going to be out. They're not going to want a scandal. It's really bizarre. But it's not real. It's a 21st century aristocratic house.
It's like McDonald's, when they designed their Big Mac, they actually hired a firm of baby food designers, because they wanted one of the criteria was that you've got to be able to swallow it after 3 bites, after 3 chews.
Yeah.
And I think Downton Abbey has that similar thing. And hey, every now and again I'll go to Mackie D's, so every now and again I'll watch something.
Sometimes you need the quick hit.
Until Sybil dies. When Sybil's dead, I'm not interested anymore. I'd lose interest weirdly. I don't know what it was, but suddenly it didn't feel as much. One of the things that we can't finish without talking about, one of the sort of heroes of the book, I think is Nigel Neal. He sort of runs through at least the first half of the book. He comes up again and again and again. What an amazing contribution! And why don't we know more about that? Why isn't he more credited as a figure?
Credited? Yeah, no, I agree. It's extraordinary. I mean, I really make no apologies in thinking that, I mean, I would put him kind of in sort of post-war culture along with Orwell, Ballard, Aldous Huxley, kind of right. Sort of, it's because it's in that sort of world that he is working in terms of thought. You know, he's sort of trying to find new kind of language to express what the ways the world has changed after the apocalypse of the Second World War and the dangers of where society is heading. And, you know, he's a science fiction writer. He's also, you know, he did quite a lot of just more straight literary adaptations for film and television as well. Did the film of Look Back in Anger, for example, which is sort of quite a surprising thing. You know, he did this amazing 1954 TV production of 1984 with Peter Cushing, which is an amazing piece.
I have not seen that, and it's
really great. It's a fabulous one. Cushing is amazing in it, and it's just really very sort of dark and noirish, and the music is sort of deeply sort of deep grind. And I think, you know, Nigel Neal, who was a scriptwriter who started working for the BBC in the 50s and kind of got a break when there was a gap in the schedules in 1953, and he had to sort of come up with a series, and came up with the first of the Quatermass series, which I definitely see as a precursor to Doctor Who in a sense, in that kind of featured a main character who was sort of scientist come hero. You know, the Quatermass franchise has become quite celebrated, but not super well known, I would say. I mean, you know, nothing like Doctor Who, but really interesting. They got made four TV series and 3 movies. You know, Hammer did their own versions of them.
And Quatermass and the Pit has a good shout out to be one of the best sort of British made science fiction films ever, I think.
Definitely, yeah. And, you know, again, you know, it's a science fiction film, but it's about something being dug up from underground. It's about a spaceship, you know, that from 5,000 years ago that crashed under what is now London. And the digging up of it provokes all sorts of horror and kind of buried kind of atavistic memories. And so, it contains a lot of those ideas as well. But he seemed to, and again, you know, Nigel Neal was one of those contradictory figures where he was trying to think of a new, you know, he was imagining futures. I mean, the TV play The Year of the Sex Olympics, you know, I also think it's one of the great TV productions ever. It's a sort of futuristic world governed by mass entertainment, where the kind of population is sort of kept pacified. And, you know, he imagined it's filmed in the late 60s. It's filmed in a very sort of glossy, glittery sort of production, which is really great late 60s evocation of a future. You know, but at the same time, he kind of had this conservatism as well, you know, because he was dismayed at the effects of mass entertainment, even though that's where he made his career. You know, he was warning. A lot of his things are warnings about what mass entertainment can do to a population psyche. And he was intrigued by the dangers of the things that lie buried, you know, sort of literally and metaphorically. And the stone tape, which you mentioned earlier on, you know, another total landmark in British TV. And, you know, in an interesting way, I found one of the hardest ones to place in the map of the book. It kind of fits in a lot of different places potentially. You know, is something that both deals with memories kind of recorded into stone, but also about the use of high technology to extract those memories and kind of the way that interacts with sort of repressed memories in the human mind as well. I mean, it's very sophisticated thinking for television. And, you know, he sort of managed to write wonderful screenplays that were not in any way dumbed down, you know, but still kind of, you know, it was great storytelling. Again, and also worked, I mean, he wasn't just a science fiction writer as well. He did a lot of stuff set in the real world as well. But I mean, the big sort of loss in a way is this script called The Road, which was a play broadcast in 1963, but it seems to have been wiped, which sounds fascinating, which is a sort of apocalyptic time travel thing where there's, I think it's like 17th century travelers in a coach who hear these terrible screams in the forest around them, and it turns out that they're hearing the future screams of people dying in a nuclear attack. And that's 1963. That is quite a sort of amazing thing to imagine on television at that time, I think.
Oh, you just want the BFI to put that script together with a sort of a young director who...
It should totally. Ben Wheatley, come on down. Maybe it is time to make that properly. I mean, it's a great idea, and I think Nigel Kneale was really good at sort of reimagining, rethinking things. The normal sort of time travel thing is that you hear echoes from the past, and his thing was he was imagining people in the past hearing echoes from the future. That is again, for the time he was writing, that was a really novel idea, I think.
Yeah, I would encourage anybody to read this book, even if you're not my age, because it will lead you to like a cave full of buried treasure that, fortunately, is, as you say, except for the road, is mostly available. So before we finish though, Rob, could I ask you for a recommendation for a film book that you've read and you want to recommend our listeners to find?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, sort of, I referred to a lot of books in the writing of this book, and there's a lot of film books on film and television that are kind of really useful, but not necessarily kind of great pieces of writing or literature, So sort of definitely there's space in writing on film for more, more sort of imaginative approaches potentially. But I think the one that probably sticks out, in terms of the books around this sort of Magic Box project, I'd probably say Michael Powell's memoirs, A Life in Movies and $1 Million Movie, just because they're sort of... it's just, I don't know if you've read any of those. They're enormous. There's 2 volumes, absolutely gigantic books. And but he's sort of got a phenomenal recall and gives you an amazing picture of the film industry, pre-Second World War, not really pulling any punches in terms of certain personalities, amazing descriptions of how practically effects were achieved on most of the Powell and Pressburger movies, lots of sort of strong, very partisan opinions about all sorts of things, interesting character portraits of people, and very frank about his own relationships. So, the story he tells, it's such a long arc, and the book sort of starts with him sitting on a transatlantic flight in the present he was writing, which I think was the mid-80s, 86 or 87, as an old man, and he literally says, I'm sitting on this plane, writing these pages sort of thing, and then it sort of is, so it really puts you very much in his here and now, and then it's just like this incredible panorama of a life, literally, as I said, a life in movies that unfolds after it. And it's at the same time a very singular view, being Michael Powell, whose own relationship to the industry became increasingly quite his own path in a way he went down, but I think probably just in terms of the sort of vividness of it, I think it was a great read and really a really amazing work of recall.
Oh well, you've sold me. I know Powell and Pressburger movies, and I'm a big fan. Obviously, I've got the big box set that I worked my way through a few years ago. So yeah, I don't know why I've never actually come across those, or I think I've known about them, but I've never sought them out.
Yeah, well, they're pretty daunting in size, and they do, they do ramble at times. I'm not saying.
I've read Finnegan's Wake. Nothing holds any fear for me anymore. Listen, Rob, thank you so much for joining us on Writers on Film. And thank you very much. Best of luck with the book.
Thanks a lot, John. It's been great talking to you.
Well, that was my conversation with Rob. I hope you enjoyed it. His recommended book was Michael Powell's A Life in Pictures. And the only thing I need to do now is, what do I need to do? The only thing I need to do now is thank Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood for the art. And until next week, please take care.